Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. There is a version of Marie Antoinette that almost everyone already knows. The one with the towering powdered wig, the extravagance, the cake, the guillotine. She has been a symbol for so long that the actual person underneath all of that has become surprisingly easy to miss. Tonight, we go back to the very beginning, to a girl born into one of the most powerful families in Europe, handed a role she never truly chose, and caught inside a storm that had been building long before she arrived in France. If this kind of slow, thoughtful history is something you genuinely enjoy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you might think, and it means a great deal. And before we begin, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. It sounds like a small thing, but there is something quietly wonderful about knowing that someone in Melbourne at 2 a.m. and someone in Toronto just after midnight are both settling in for the same story tonight. Get comfortable, adjust your pillow if you need to, let your shoulders drop. Tonight we are going back to the 18th century, to the grand and complicated world of Vienna, the Habsburg court, and the young girl who would one day become the last queen of France. The story of Marie Antoinette does not begin in France. It begins in Vienna, inside one of the most formidable dynasties the European continent had ever produced, in a household that ran entirely on ceremony, expectation, and the calculated use of family members as instruments of foreign policy. The Habsburg Empire in the middle of the 18th century was one of the great powers of the continent. It stretched across Central Europe, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and a dozen other territories, bound together under one crown, and it was ruled, at that moment, by a woman. Maria Theresa was the Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary and Bohemia in her own right, which was unusual enough that several neighbouring rulers had spent the early years of her reign trying to take her throne away from her. They failed. Maria Theresa was formidable in a way that few people anticipated, and she ran her court, her government, and her children with a focused, demanding energy that left very little room for sentiment. On November 2nd, 1755, in the east wing of the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna was born. She was the 15th of 16 children, which in the ordinary logic of dynastic politics meant she was not especially important. The Habsburg nurseries were full. The line of succession was already well covered. She was one small child in a very large family, and for the first few years of her life, she was mostly allowed to simply be that a child, playing in wide gardens, surrounded by siblings, largely untouched by the machinery of empire that hummed constantly around her. Schönbrunn itself was not a modest place. The palace had over 1,400 rooms, sat on the western edge of Vienna like a small city unto itself, and was maintained with the kind of elaborate grandeur that great empires use to remind everyone, including themselves, of how significant they are. The gardens were geometric and perfectly trimmed. The interiors were yellow and gold. Court life followed rituals that had been refined over generations, and the Habsburg children grew up inside all of it, as though excess was simply the natural texture of daily existence. Maria Antonia was, by most accounts, a cheerful child. She was quick to smile, easy in company, genuinely fond of music, and almost entirely uninterested in sitting still long enough to absorb anything formally difficult. Her education, to put it gently, was not her most impressive quality. By the time she was 10 years old, she could not write properly in either French or German. Her spelling was unreliable. Her handwriting made her tutors quietly despairing. She had some real talent at the harpsichord, a genuine gift for dancing, and an instinctive warmth with people that made her likable almost immediately. But in terms of structured learning, she was significantly behind where her mother expected her to be. Maria Theresa noticed. Maria Theresa noticed everything. The Empress was not a soft or easy mother. She loved her children that appears to have been genuine, but she also understood them, with perfect clarity, as instruments of statecraft. This was not cruelty. It was simply the Habsburg way, practiced across generations with the calm efficiency of a long-running operation. Marriages were alliances, children were diplomatic assets. Personal affection was real, but was never permitted to interfere with the larger calculations of power. Maria Theresa wrote long, detailed letters to her children throughout their lives, letters that mixed maternal concern with political instruction in a way that made the two nearly impossible to separate. Her father, Emperor Francis I, died in August 1765, when Maria Antonia was 9 years old. The loss settled over the household in a way that did not fully lift. Maria Theresa wore mourning black for the rest of her life from that point forward, and threw herself even harder into the work of governing. The court grew quieter. A low, steady grief became part of its permanent atmosphere, and the children grew up with it as a kind of background condition present, unspoken and always there. Across the continent, meanwhile, France was ruled by Louis XV, aging, politically weakened, and presiding over a kingdom that had been quietly accumulating difficulties it lacked the will to address. The 7 Years' War had ended in 1763, badly and expensively for France. The treasury was strained. The alliance between France and Austria, formalised in 1756, in what historians would later call the Diplomatic Revolution, was politically important to both sides, but had never felt entirely natural to either. Keeping it alive required maintenance, and the most reliable form of dynastic maintenance was a marriage. France had a young heir. Louis Auguste, the Duc de Berry, was the grandson of Louis XV. Quiet, reportedly awkward, not especially commanding in person, but heir to the French throne nonetheless. Austria had a daughter of the right age. The logic was straightforward, and Maria Theresa had been turning it over for some time before the formal negotiations began. The daughter selected was Maria Antonia. She was 11 years old when discussions became serious. No one consulted her. This was not an oversight, it was simply how the world operated at that level, where nations secured their interests through the marriages of children, wrapped the arrangement in ceremony and silk, and called it statecraft. There was no particular cruelty intended. It was the machinery of dynastic politics running as it always had, and Maria Antonia happened to be the piece that fit the space that needed filling. What followed was a sudden, urgent overhauling of everything in her education. French tutors arrived at Schönbrunn with new purpose, etiquette lessons intensified. Dancing, deportment, posture, language, table manners, all of it was accelerated, because the timeline was now real, and the girl being sent to France needed to arrive in a condition that France could receive without embarrassment. The natural warmth and the restless energy were still there, but they were now being carefully shaped toward a single end, to make her into something resembling a queen before she had ever had the chance to simply become a person. The girl in the Schönbrunn gardens, the one who disliked lessons and loved to dance, was not disappearing, but she was being reorganized, quietly and systematically, by forces that had decided her future long before she was old enough to have any thoughts about it herself. The Empress's bargain. To understand what Maria Theresa was arranging for her daughter, it helps to understand what she had already arranged for the rest of her children. By the time serious negotiations for Marie Antoinette's French marriage began, Maria Theresa had already deployed her family across the map of Europe, with the precision of someone playing a very long game. Her eldest daughter, Maria Anna, had been sent to govern the Austrian Netherlands. Her son Leopold was installed in Tuscany. Her daughter, Maria Carolina, would eventually go to Naples. Another daughter, Maria Amalia, was sent to Parma. The Habsburg children were not simply a family, they were a network, carefully positioned across the continent, each one serving as a node in the Empress's web of alliances. France was the most important node of all. The Franco-Austrian alliance, signed in 1756, had reversed over 2 centuries of rivalry between the two powers. For most of European history, France and the Habsburgs had been natural enemies competing for influence, fighting over territory, organising opposing coalitions against each other with reliable regularity. The alliance of 1756 had been a genuine shock to the diplomatic world, the kind of realignment that happens rarely and requires considerable maintenance to survive. Maria Theresa understood that alliances sealed on paper were fragile. Alliances sealed through marriage were considerably harder to undo. The French heir in question had not always been Louis Auguste. The original plan, in earlier years, had involved other pairings, other children, but succession at Versailles moved in unexpected directions. Louis XV's son, the Dauphin Louis Ferdinand, had died in 1765. His eldest son had followed him into an early grave not long after. By the late 1760s, the heir to France was Louis Auguste, the Duc de Berry, quiet, heavy-set, more comfortable in his workshop repairing locks than in the elaborate social theatre of Versailles. He was not, by any account that survives, a natural match for a vivacious and restless girl from Vienna, but he was going to be King of France, and that was the only qualification that truly mattered to the people making this decision. The formal negotiations between Vienna and Versailles involved the French foreign minister, the Duc de Choiseul, on one side, and the Austrian Chancellor Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz on the other. Both men were experienced, careful, and deeply aware of what was at stake. The details took time: the size of Marie Antoinette's dowry, the terms of her renunciation of Habsburg inheritance claims, the composition of her household in France, the protocols governing her transition from Austrian archduchess to French Dauphine. These were not small matters. They were hammered out over months of correspondence, and Maria Theresa reviewed every detail herself. While the diplomats worked, the practical business of turning Maria Antonia into something France would accept continued at Schönbrunn with increasing urgency. The most significant figure in this process was the Abbé de Vermond, a French cleric and scholar sent by Versailles specifically to assess and educate the young archduchess. His first report back to France was honest, to the point of being uncomfortable. "The girl was charming," he wrote. "She was engaging, quick to laugh, easy to be fond of. But her attention span was limited, her intellectual formation was incomplete, and her French, while improving, was still far from polished. He noted that she had more grace than depth, and that her mind moved too quickly from one thing to the next to stay with anything difficult for long. What he did not say, though it is readable between the lines of his assessments, is that he also genuinely liked her. He would remain a presence in her life for years, which suggests that whatever her educational limitations, she was the kind of person who inspired loyalty in the people who spent real time with her. The physical preparation was equally thorough. A French dentist was brought to Vienna because Marie Antoinette's teeth, while not severely problematic, needed attention before she could be presented at Versailles, a detail that gives a rather precise sense of how carefully every aspect of her presentation was being managed. A specialist in court deportment worked with her on posture and movement. Her dancing, already her strongest skill, was refined further. The way she held her head, the way she walked into a room, the angle at which she acknowledged people of different social ranks, all of it was practiced, corrected, and practiced again. Meanwhile, Maria Theresa was composing something else entirely, a set of written instructions for her daughter to take into her new life. The Empress produced detailed guidance on everything from how to manage relationships with the French royal family to how to handle her religious practice, her public behaviour, and her relationship with the French people. Some of it was practical, some of it was stern. The underlying message running through all of it was that Marie Antoinette was no longer simply a daughter, she was a representative of the Habsburg dynasty, and everything she did in France would reflect back on Austria. Maria Theresa was not wrong about this, but the instructions also reflected a certain gap in understanding. The Empress's clear-eyed grasp of diplomatic reality did not fully account for how different Versailles would be from Vienna, how little room a Dauphine actually had to manoeuvre, and how quickly the French court would begin shaping its newest member in directions that no amount of written instruction from Vienna could fully anticipate. The formal betrothal ceremony took place in Vienna on April 19th, 1770. The Duc de Berry was not present, he was represented by proxy, as was common in royal marriages of the period, by Marie Antoinette's own brother, Archduke Ferdinand. There is something slightly surreal about the arrangement, even by the standards of the time. A 14-year-old girl formally pledging herself in marriage to a boy she had never met, represented in the ceremony by her own sibling, standing in for a stranger. The ceremony was grand, as Habsburg ceremonies always were. The feeling in the room for Maria Theresa, for the girl in the white and silver gown, was probably considerably more complicated. The weeks that followed were consumed with the logistics of departure. A trousseau of enormous scale was assembled: gowns, linens, jewellery, accessories, because Marie Antoinette could not arrive in France with anything that had an Austrian origin. The French court's rules about this were absolute, and would become literal in a way the young archduchess had not fully grasped yet. The ladies who had surrounded her since childhood began to be replaced, at least formally, by the household being assembled for her French life. The Viennese world she had always known was being systematically removed from around her. Maria Theresa said goodbye to her daughter, knowing, with the clarity that practical rulers tend to possess about such things, that she was unlikely to see her again. The distance between Vienna and Versailles was not simply geographical. Once Marie Antoinette crossed the border into France, she would belong to France. Her loyalties, her household, her daily existence. The correspondence would continue, and it did, for years. But the relationship between mother and daughter would now be conducted entirely through letters, through intermediaries, through the careful management of messages crossing hundreds of miles of European road. What Maria Theresa felt about this privately is difficult to know with certainty. She was not a woman who put her private feelings on paper in straightforward terms. What can be said is that she had done what she believed was necessary, politically and dynastically, and that she carried out the separation with the same focused will she brought to everything else. The Habsburg way was to arrange the board as well as possible, and then release the piece to play its role. The piece, in this case, was a 14-year-old girl with a gift for dancing, a dislike of formal study, and a warmth that made people like her almost immediately. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, travelling toward a country whose language she still did not speak perfectly, to marry a man she had never seen, and to take up a position at one of the most demanding and unforgiving courts in the world. The carriage was made ready. The route was planned. The ceremonies along the way were arranged in careful sequence, and on April 21st, 1770, Maria Antonia left Vienna for the last time, crossing into France. The journey from Vienna to the French border took the better part of 2 weeks. The route moved northwest through the Habsburg territories, through towns that lined the roads with people who had come out to watch a procession of carriages carrying a princess they would never see again. It was a slow journey by necessity. The convoy was large. The roads of Central Europe in April of 1770 were not built for speed, and there were stops along the way for rest, for ceremony, for the careful maintenance of a schedule that had been planned months in advance. For a 14-year-old who had rarely travelled beyond the grounds of Schönbrunn, the landscape passing outside the carriage window was new in every direction. The towns grew less familiar. The faces of the people at the roadside were strangers. The Viennese accent of her attendants was one of the last remaining sounds connecting her to the world she had left behind. The convoy reached the Rhine River in early May. On the 7th of May, 1770, it stopped at a small island in the middle of the river, a flat, unremarkable stretch of land near the town of Kehl, across from Strasbourg. Under normal circumstances, this island would have been of no interest to anyone. But for the purposes of transferring a Habsburg archduchess to the French crown, it had been selected as the site of a ceremony with no exact parallel in ordinary life. And in the weeks before Marie Antoinette's arrival, a great deal of effort had gone into preparing it. A pavilion had been constructed specifically for the occasion, divided precisely along its centre into 2 halves. One side was designated Austrian territory, the other was French. The line between them marked by a strip of decorative material running across the floor, represented the border symbolic, but treated by everyone present with complete seriousness. The ceremony that took place inside this pavilion was called the remise, or the handover, and it proceeded according to protocol that had been established for exactly this kind of royal transfer. Marie Antoinette entered from the Austrian side with her Viennese attendants. What followed in the rooms of that pavilion was, in practical terms, a complete dismantling of her Austrian identity. Every item of clothing she wore, her gown, her shoes, her undergarments, was removed and replaced with French equivalents. Her jewellery was exchanged. The ladies who had surrounded her since childhood, who had dressed her and travelled with her and spoken to her in German, were formally dismissed on the Austrian side of the room. They could not cross the line. They belonged to the country she was leaving. Her dog could not cross either. She had a small pug she was devoted to, a compact, flat-faced animal named Mops that had made the journey from Vienna tucked somewhere in the travelling arrangements. The French household was quite clear on this point. The dog was Austrian and could not accompany her into France. Whether the protocol drafters of 1770 considered this a significant detail or simply a logical extension of the same principle that governed the clothing is not recorded, but it is the kind of detail that tends to stay in the historical record precisely because it cuts through all the ceremony and gets to something plainly human. On the French side of the pavilion, a new household was waiting. At its head stood the Comtesse de Noailles, appointed as Marie Antoinette's chief lady-in-waiting and the primary manager of her daily life at Versailles. The Comtesse was thorough, correct, and deeply committed to the precise observation of French court etiquette in all its layered complexity. She would come to be known, not entirely affectionately, by the nickname Madame Etiquette, a title bestowed by Marie Antoinette herself in the months ahead, when the relentless attention to protocol began to feel more like surveillance than service. But that was still in the future. At the pavilion on the Rhine island, the Comtesse simply represented France, and France had its own way of doing things. The name changed in that room too. Maria Antonia became Marie Antoinette, the French version, softer in its vowels, easier on a French tongue, and carrying no trace of the Austrian original. It was a small adjustment in one sense. In another sense, it was a final marker of what had happened in that pavilion. The person who had walked in from the Austrian side was not quite the same person who walked out on the French side. Strasbourg received her with genuine enthusiasm. The city was close enough to the German-speaking world to feel the Habsburg connection as something familiar rather than foreign, and the crowds that lined the streets were large and welcoming. There was a reception at the cathedral, music, official greetings from local dignitaries, and the kind of elaborate public display that French civic authorities had been preparing for weeks. Marie Antoinette moved through it with the natural ease that would become one of the most consistently noted things about her public manner. She was comfortable with people, quick to smile, and seemed genuinely engaged rather than simply performing engagement, which is rarer in public figures than it sounds. The journey continued westward through France, toward the royal chateau of Compiègne, where Louis XV had arranged to meet his future granddaughter-in-law for the first time. The old king received her on May 14th. He was 60 years old, considerably diminished from the figure he had cut in younger decades, but still capable of the kind of practiced charm that long experience at court produces. His greeting was warm. He approved of her, or said that he did, which amounted to the same thing in the language of Versailles. Louis Auguste was also present. This was the first time Marie Antoinette and her future husband had seen each other in person after years of negotiation, preparation, and ceremony conducted entirely on their behalf, and largely without their participation. Louis Auguste was 15. He was tall for his age, heavy-set, and stood through the meeting in a state of visible awkwardness that everyone noticed and no one mentioned. He did not say much. What he thought of the girl from Vienna being presented to him is not recorded in any reliable source. He was not, at this stage of his life, someone who committed his interior life to paper. What is clear is that the meeting was brief, formal, and managed entirely by the adults around them. 2 days later, on May 16, 1770, the wedding took place at the Palace of Versailles. The chapel at Versailles, built during the reign of Louis XIV and not modest about it, held the full weight of the French court for the ceremony. The guests numbered in the hundreds. The gowns, the jewellery, the wigs, and the general level of visual elaboration were at the upper end of even Versailles' considerable range. Marie Antoinette wore a white gown with a train so heavy it required attendants to manage it, decorated with diamonds and white flowers, and her hair was dressed high in the French fashion she was only beginning to learn, was the standard expectation at court. The ceremony was performed by the Archbishop of Reims. The rings were exchanged. The legal instruments were signed. Louis Auguste's handwriting on the marriage register was reportedly steady enough. Marie Antoinette's, by contrast, ran slightly off the line, a small human slip in the middle of a very large occasion. That evening, following a public dinner at which the entire court watched the royal couple eat in the traditional French fashion seated at a table on a raised platform, with hundreds of observers standing at a respectful distance and watching every bite, the newlyweds were escorted to the marriage chamber with the full ceremony that French royal custom demanded. The morning after, Louis Auguste wrote a single line in his personal diary. It read, "Nothing." He used that word in the French of the time to record that nothing had happened. No wedding night, in any practical sense, had taken place. Whether this was nerves, indifference, uncertainty, or something else entirely was a question that would occupy the French court, the Austrian embassy, and eventually both of their mothers for the next several years. But on that first morning in Versailles, none of that complexity was visible yet. The ceremony had been completed. The alliance was sealed. A 14-year-old girl from Vienna was now the Dauphine of France. Versailles, the gilded cage. Versailles was not simply a palace. By the time Marie Antoinette arrived in 1770, it had been the centre of French royal life for nearly a century, and in that time it had developed into something that functioned more like a carefully managed theatre than a place where people actually lived. Louis XIV had designed it that way deliberately. By concentrating the French nobility inside one enormous building, requiring their physical presence at court as a condition of remaining relevant, he had transformed the aristocracy from a potential military threat into an audience dependent on royal favour, competing for positions and proximity, and too busy watching each other to cause political trouble. The system had worked extraordinarily well for Louis XIV. 100 years later, it was still running, still elaborate, and in many ways still effective. It had also accumulated layers of ritual and protocol that had grown so complex over the intervening decades that navigating them required something close to a specialist's training. Marie Antoinette had been given a version of that training in Vienna, but no amount of preparation in an Austrian palace fully prepares a person for the specific weight of Versailles up close. The first thing she would have understood, within days of arriving, was that privacy at Versailles was largely a fiction. The royal family did not live privately. They lived publicly, in front of an audience, according to rituals that had been codified over generations and from which almost no deviation was permitted. The morning ceremony called the lever was the most explicit example of this. Every morning, the Dauphine and later the Queen rose from bed, not in solitude, but in stages, with members of the court admitted to her bedchamber in a precise sequence determined by rank. The first group entered, then a higher-ranking group, then higher still. At each stage, different elements of the morning routine, washing, dressing, arranging the hair, were performed in front of whoever had been admitted at that point. The right to hand certain garments to the Dauphine was itself a privilege, assigned to specific ladies according to their position, and if a more senior lady entered the room while a junior one was already holding a garment, the item had to be passed up the hierarchy before it could be presented. There was a well-recorded incident early in Marie Antoinette's time at Versailles, in which the ritual of handing over her chemies became so caught up in questions of precedence that she was left standing, undressed and visibly cold, while two ladies sorted out who ranked higher. The room full of observers watched in silence. The procedure was followed correctly. The chemise was eventually delivered through the proper channels. Marie Antoinette, by one account, laughed a short, slightly helpless laugh that acknowledged the absurdity of the moment, without actually challenging the system that produced it. It was a response that revealed something about her character. She could see how ridiculous a thing was, and still find herself trapped inside it. The Comtesse de Noailles, Madame Etiquette, as Marie Antoinette had taken to calling her in private, managed these ceremonies with an intensity that suggested she considered them sacred. To the Comtesse, the protocols of Versailles were not arbitrary or excessive. They were the visible structure of an ordered world, the means by which rank was expressed and maintained, the architecture of a society that depended on everyone knowing exactly where they stood. Every deviation, however small, was a crack in that structure, and cracks in structures tend to widen. Marie Antoinette found the Comtesse exhausting, which is understandable. She also found the entire ceremonial apparatus of the court exhausting in ways she was not entirely free to express. The evening ritual, the coucher, the public preparation for sleep mirrored the morning in reverse, with another audience, another sequence of ranked attendance, another careful performance of something that everywhere else in the world was done alone. Even eating was a performance. The grand couvert, the formal public meal, was held regularly at Versailles, with the royal family seated at a table on a raised platform, while members of the court and sometimes members of the general public stood at a respectful distance and watched the meat. Versailles was, among other things, a destination. People travelled to see it. The social landscape Marie Antoinette had to navigate was layered in ways that went beyond the formal hierarchy of rank. There were factions, alliances, and long-running rivalries that had their own internal logic, and that a newcomer had to map carefully before taking any position on anything. The most immediate complication came from two directions simultaneously. On one side were mesdames, the three surviving daughters of Louis XV, called Adélaïde, Victoire, and Sophie, who occupied apartments at Versailles and exercised a kind of unofficial moral authority over court life by virtue of their position as the king's daughters. They had firm opinions about propriety, religion, and the proper conduct of a dauphin, and they were not shy about sharing those opinions. They had taken an interest in Marie Antoinette that was partly maternal and partly strategic. She was young, they could influence her, and having the future Queen of France oriented in their direction had obvious advantages. On the other side was Madame du Barry-Louis, the 15th's official mistress, a woman of non-aristocratic origin who had risen to a position of extraordinary influence over the aging king, and whose presence at Versailles was a source of genuine scandal to those who felt it violated the moral order of things. Mesdames despised her. Much of the formal court viewed her with discomfort. But Louis XV was still the king, and Madame du Barry's access to him made her genuinely powerful in practical terms, whatever anyone thought of her origins or her relationship with the monarch. Marie Antoinette's position in relation to Madame du Barry was shaped in part by Maria Theresa's instructions, and in part by the pressure applied through the Austrian ambassador Prince Starhemberg, who reported regularly to Vienna on the Dauphine's conduct. The Empress had made clear that her daughter should not openly antagonize the king's mistress. Louis XV's goodwill mattered, and pointlessly offending him through his companion was not a useful diplomatic move. But the Dauphine was also receiving pressure from mesdames, who wanted her to demonstrate her disapproval of Madame du Barry through the simple act of never speaking to her directly. Marie Antoinette, caught between these competing pressures and still finding her footing, split the difference for a considerable time by simply not acknowledging Madame du Barry at all, neither embracing her nor publicly snubbing her, simply treating her as something the official gaze did not quite land on. This worked as a short-term strategy but created its own tensions, and the question of whether the Dauphin would ever formally speak to the king's mistress became, in the small but intensely concentrated world of Versailles politics, a matter of actual diplomatic consequence. Beyond the political geography, there was the physical geography of Versailles itself. The palace was enormous. Its hall of mirrors alone ran over 200 feet along the garden front, lined with 17 arched mirrors, reflecting 17 arched windows looking out over the formal gardens. The grounds stretched for miles and contained fountains, canals, groves, and, further out, the smaller retreats of the Grand and Petit Trianon. The Petit Trianon in particular would become significant later, but in these early months it was simply one part of a vast property that Marie Antoinette was still learning to navigate. What she found, in the first months at Versailles, was that the palace was most bearable outdoors. The gardens offered something the interior could not, a degree of informality, fresh air, and the relative freedom of open space. She walked in them regularly. She rode. She attended the hunts that were a central part of the French court's outdoor calendar, riding well enough to impress the people watching. It was one of the few activities at Versailles where skill mattered more than rank, where something real was happening rather than being performed. The performance, meanwhile, never stopped. The audience never fully left, and the girl who had arrived from Vienna in May was slowly, sometimes awkwardly, learning what it meant to live inside a court that watched everything and forgot nothing. The awkward husband. Louis Auguste, the young man Marie Antoinette had married, was in most respects her opposite. Where she moved through a room naturally and drew people toward her without apparent effort, he retreated. Where she was restless and social, he was withdrawn and most comfortable in small spaces with practical tasks. He was not stupid, he read widely, had a genuine interest in science and geography, spoke some English, and kept meticulous records of his daily activities in a diary he maintained with consistent discipline. He was also, in the specific context of Versailles, almost completely ill-suited to the performance that court life required. His clearest passion, in those early years, was hunting. He rode out almost every day the weather allowed, returning physically exhausted and noticeably more at ease than he ever appeared inside the palace. His second great interest was mechanical work. He had a forge and a set of locksmithing tools installed in a room near his private apartments, and he spent considerable time there, filing metal, constructing mechanisms, and doing the kind of focused physical work that produces something tangible at the end of it. It was the hobby of a craftsman, which said something honest about the kind of mind he had: concrete, careful, more comfortable with problems that had clear solutions than with the fluid social negotiations of court life. Being King of France would not offer many problems with clear solutions, which was a difficulty that would only become apparent later. The marriage, in the years following the wedding, remained unconsummated. This was known almost immediately to the people whose business it was to know such things, which at Versailles meant nearly everyone. The morning reports from the royal bedchamber, another of those Versailles rituals that collapsed the distance between the private and the institutional, made the situation plain. The court observed, speculated, and conducted the speculation with the particular energy that enclosed communities bring to subjects they are not supposed to discuss openly. The political implications were serious. A Dauphine who was not yet a wife in any practical sense was not producing heirs, and the production of heirs was the primary function the marriage had been designed to serve. The Franco-Austrian alliance rested in part on the assumption that the union would generate a successor. Without that, the arrangement was a ceremony without consequence, and Maria Theresa, receiving reports from her ambassador in Paris, was growing visibly anxious. The ambassador in question was Count Florimond de Mercy-Argenteau, an Austrian diplomat of considerable skill and patience who served throughout this period as Maria Theresa's eyes and ears at Versailles. He reported on Marie Antoinette's conduct with a thoroughness that extended to her friendships, her spending, her relationships with the various court factions, and the state of her marriage. His dispatches were detailed, candid, and sometimes critical. He had genuine affection for the young Dauphine, but his first loyalty was to Vienna, and he did not soften his assessments when writing to the Empress. Maria Theresa wrote to her daughter with increasing frequency and increasing directness on the subject of the marriage. The letters were concerned, insistent, and at times uncomfortable in their specificity. She pressed Marie Antoinette to be more attentive to her husband, more careful in her conduct, more focused on the one outcome that mattered most from Vienna's perspective. The correspondence from this period gives a clear picture of the pressure Marie Antoinette was operating under from her mother's direction, advice arriving from hundreds of miles away, framed as concern, but carrying the weight of diplomatic necessity. What actually prevented the marriage from being consummated for so long is a question historians have approached from several directions. The most commonly cited explanation is that Louis Auguste had a physical condition, a structural issue that made intimacy uncomfortable or impractical, that was eventually resolved either by a minor surgical procedure or simply by the passage of time and the counsel of his brother-in-law, the Emperor Joseph II, who visited France in 1777 and apparently discussed the matter with considerable frankness. The medical details are genuinely unclear, and accounts written close to the events were not always reliable. What is not disputed is that the situation lasted 7 years, that it caused real political anxiety, and that it left Marie Antoinette in an awkward position for all of that time formerly a wife, functionally without the status that producing an heir would have provided. In the meantime, she filled her days in the ways available to her. She gathered a circle of younger courtiers around herself, people closer to her own age who were easier company than the older factions that had been watching her since her arrival. The Princess de Lamballe became a close companion, gentle, undemanding, loyal in a way that the sharper personalities of the court were not. Later, Gabrielle de Polignac would enter this circle and become perhaps the most significant friendship of Marie Antoinette's life, though that was still some years ahead. Gambling was a constant at Versailles, and Marie Antoinette developed a genuine taste for it. Card games played late into the evenings in private apartments, with the kind of money-changing hands that would have been extraordinary to the vast majority of French people, and was treated, within the court, as an unremarkable element of social life. Fashion also absorbed her attention and her budget, in ways that were beginning to attract comment even within the palace, but it would be a mistake to read the gambling and the fashion as simple frivolity. They were also social tools, ways of cementing relationships, of existing in a position of some influence even without political power, of being the centre of a world she could actually manage, since the larger world of the court remained mostly outside her reach. Louis XV died on May 10th, 1774. The cause was smallpox, a disease that moved through Versailles with enough speed and severity that anyone who had not had it was advised to leave, and those who stayed to attend the dying king did so in the awareness that they were taking a genuine risk. He had been ill for 2 weeks, and the final days were not dignified. The court, unable to do anything practical, organised itself around the vigil with the elaborate formality that Versailles brought to everything. The moment of the king's death was announced by a signal that had been arranged in advance, a noise, a shift in the movement of people through the corridors. In the apartments where Louis Auguste and Marie Antoinette had been waiting, they reportedly fell to their knees together. Louis Auguste said, in one of the few personal statements from this moment that has been reliably preserved, that he and his wife felt crushed by the weight that had just fallen on them. He was 19 years old. She was 18. Neither of them had been prepared for this with any real substance. The years of waiting had been spent in the rituals of court life rather than the education of future rulers. The titles changed immediately. Louis Auguste was now Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre. Marie Antoinette was Queen of France. The apartments, the ceremonies, the obligations, the scrutiny, all of it expanded in proportion to the new titles. The hierarchy of Versailles reorganized itself around them overnight, as hierarchies do when a new summit appears. What did not change immediately was the marriage. That remained, for another 3 years, in the same state it had been in from the beginning. The new king still went hunting most mornings. The new queen still gathered her circle of companions in the evenings, and Versailles, which had absorbed the deaths of kings and the coronations of successors for nearly a century, continued its elaborate performance as though the transition was simply another ceremony in an endless sequence of ceremonies. The world inside the palace walls, France, in the 1770s, was a country of approximately 28 million people, and the vast majority of them had never seen Versailles and never would. The palace and the world inside it represented one specific and unusually concentrated version of French life, extreme, theatrical, and in many ways completely detached from the conditions most French people navigated every day. To understand what was building outside the palace gates in those years, it helps to look at who was living where and what they were wearing, eating, and thinking. At the top of the structure sat the court nobility, the families who held titles, who maintained apartments at Versailles or in the great houses of Paris, who existed in a world of almost total luxury, managed almost entirely by servants. A noble household of any standing would have dozens of staff. Dressing was a morning event requiring help. Meals were elaborate and multi-course, served on fine porcelain with silverware and accompanied by wines from the best estates. The daily schedule of a Versailles courtier moved through morning mass, attendance at royal ceremonies, afternoon visits and card games, formal dinners, and evening entertainments, an existence so thoroughly organised around social performance that there was genuinely little time left for private life, which was perhaps the point. What they wore announced who they were with the precision of a uniform. For noblewomen at Versailles, the dominant fashion through the 1770s was the robe à la Française, a gown worn over wide pannier frames that extended the skirt sideways, sometimes to a width of several feet on either side. Moving through a standard doorway in full court dress required a particular kind of practiced sideways manoeuvre that every court lady learned as a matter of practical survival. The fabrics were silk, brocade, velvet produced in the great textile workshops of Lyon, in patterns that changed seasonally and cost accordingly. Jewellery ran to diamonds, pearls, and coloured stones worn in elaborate settings, and the total value of a well-dressed noblewoman's appearance on a formal occasion could represent decades of income for a working family. The hair was its own architecture. By the early 1770s, the fashionable silhouette at Versailles demanded height, and what was produced in response was the pouf, a construction of real and artificial hair, wire frames, powder, and decoration that could rise 2 feet or more above the head, and accommodate, within its structure, miniature scenes of remarkable specificity. Flowers were standard, small feathers were standard, but the most ambitious versions carried ships, pastoral landscapes, bowls of fruit, and in one documented case a model of a naval battle. The powder used to whiten the hair was flour-based, which meant that the fashionable heads of Versailles were, from a certain angle, literally wearing food. In a country where bread shortages were a recurring reality, this was the kind of detail that did not go unnoticed. Marie Antoinette was at the centre of all of this. Her dressmaker was Rose Bertin, a woman of considerable talent and even more considerable confidence who operated a fashion establishment in Paris and who had developed, through her relationship with the Queen, an influence over French fashion that earned her the informal title of Minister of Fashion. Bertin's designs for the Queen were expensive, inventive, and widely imitated what Marie Antoinette wore to a public ceremony would be discussed, sketched, and reproduced across France within weeks. Her hairdresser, Léonard Autier, was responsible for the elaborate constructions that sat above her powdered hair, and he too became a figure of genuine cultural consequence, because whatever the Queen's hair did, the court followed. A significant step below the nobility in France's social structure was the bourgeoisie, the broad and diverse middle class of merchants, lawyers, notaries, doctors, manufacturers, and educated professionals who lived primarily in the cities and larger towns. They were not poor. A successful merchant or lawyer in Paris in the 1770s ate well, dressed respectably, educated his children, and maintained a household that by any ordinary measure of the time was comfortable. Their clothing was simpler than the court's, the wide panniers were for formal occasions if at all, and daily dress tended toward more practical silhouettes, but it was made of decent fabric, kept in good repair, and worn with a self-possession that reflected a class increasingly confident in its own significance. What the bourgeoisie consumed intellectually was in some ways the most consequential thing about them. They read. They read the Encyclopédie, the great multi-volume project edited by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert that attempted to organize and distribute all human knowledge, and in doing so quietly advanced ideas about reason, liberty, and the proper basis of authority. They read Voltaire, whose sharp wit and contempt for arbitrary power circulated in editions that were officially censored and practically everywhere. They read Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas about natural equality and social contract gave a philosophical framework to feelings that were already developing without one. The salons of Paris gatherings hosted by educated women in private apartments, where writers, philosophers, and intelligent guests debated the ideas of the day, were largely bourgeois institutions, and they were producing a climate of thought that was moving in a consistent direction. Below the bourgeoisie were the artisans, the small tradespeople, and the urban working poor, the people who made things, carried things, sold things in the markets, and lived in the dense, crowded neighbourhoods of Paris and the other large French cities. Their diet was built around bread, the price of which determined the practical condition of their daily lives more directly than anything else. A good harvest year meant bread was affordable, and the city was relatively calm. A bad harvest year meant bread prices rose, wages did not follow, and the gap between what a working family earned and what it cost to feed itself became a genuine daily crisis. They also ate vegetables when available: onions, turnips, cabbage, and some dried legumes, and meat was an occasional thing rather than a regular one, available in cheaper cuts from market days. Their clothing was functional, worn until it wore out, repaired as needed, and handed down. Linen shirts and shifts formed the base layer. Woolen cloth was the outer fabric for most of the year. Colours were undyed or simply dyed in the earth tones that cheaper processes produced. The visual gap between a working woman in a Paris market and a noblewoman at Versailles was so extreme as to suggest not just different social conditions, but different physical realities, different bodies inhabiting different versions of the same country. The largest group in France was the peasantry, who made up somewhere around 80% of the total population, and who lived, for the most part, in conditions that had changed less over the preceding century than almost anything else in French life. Peasant families in the countryside grew grain, kept small animals, worked the land with tools their grandparents had used, and paid taxes to the crown, to the church as tithe, to their local lord as feudal dues that consistently took a significant portion of whatever they produced. A good year left something to live on, a bad year did not. The Enlightenment did not reach most peasant villages in any direct form. What reached them was the price of bread and the size of the harvest. When those were adequate, the deeper questions of political philosophy remained abstract. When they were not adequate, the abstraction collapsed quickly into something much more immediate. All of this was France, in the 1770s, the silks and the poufs at Versailles, the salon debates in Paris, the bread lines in the market towns, the peasant households in the countryside, and it was all in the way that large historical forces always are, connected. The extravagance at the top was visible, and it was discussed, and the ideas that circulated through the middle of French society were giving people a language with which to talk about what they saw. The distance between the world inside the palace walls and the world outside them was not just a matter of wealth. It was becoming, slowly and then less slowly, a matter of legitimacy. Queen of France. The transition from Dauphine to Queen changed the practical conditions of Marie Antoinette's life considerably. As Dauphine, she had occupied a position of high visibility but limited real authority, watched constantly, expected to behave correctly, but ultimately secondary to the ruling generation above her. As queen, there was no generation above her anymore. She was 19 years old and sat at the summit of the most elaborate court in Europe, with a husband who was already demonstrating that the weight of kingship was not entirely comfortable on his shoulders. Louis XVI's early months as king revealed a man who genuinely wanted to govern well and had only a partial understanding of how to do it. He was conscientious about his paperwork. He read documents, took meetings, tried to engage with the complexity of what was being presented to him. He was not lazy, but he was also deeply uncertain, prone to reversing decisions after making them, reluctant to hold positions under pressure, and surrounded by advisors whose interests frequently conflicted with each other and with the public good. His natural instinct when faced with a difficult choice was to delay it, which is a manageable habit in a private person and a serious liability in a king. His coronation took place at the Cathedral of Reims on June 11, 1775, following the tradition that French kings had been crowned at Reims since the 5th century. The ceremony was full and proper, the anointing with sacred oil, the crown of Charlemagne placed on the king's head, the peers of France doing homage in sequence, the birds released from the cathedral as a symbol of liberty. Marie Antoinette watched from a gallery, and by several accounts wept during the ceremony, which was noticed and generally interpreted favourably. She wrote to Maria Theresa afterward describing the moment when Louis knelt before the altar and the crowd in the cathedral called out spontaneously. Whatever else France thought of its new monarchs in those first months, there was genuine goodwill, and both of them knew it. The minister, Louis XVI, chose to address France's most urgent problem. Its finances was Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot, an economist and administrator of genuine ability who arrived at the position of Controller General in 1774 with a clear-eyed diagnosis of what was wrong and a set of reforms designed to address it. France's treasury was under serious strain from the debts accumulated through decades of expensive warfare. The system of taxation was deeply inefficient. The nobility and clergy paid almost nothing, while the burden fell disproportionately on those with the least capacity to bear it. Turgot wanted to abolish certain feudal dues, liberalise the grain trade, and introduce a land tax that would apply to all property owners regardless of social rank. The resistance was immediate and organised. The nobility, the clergy, the parliaments, the regional law courts whose members had purchased their positions and who functioned as a significant brake on royal power, all pushed back against reforms that threatened their privileges. Louis XVI, who agreed with Turgot in principle and could not hold the line against the opposition in practice, dismissed him in 1776. It was the first clear demonstration of a pattern that would repeat throughout his reign. Well-intentioned reform attempted, structural resistance applied, king retreating. The problems remained. The window for addressing them gradually narrowed. Marie Antoinette's relationship with Turgot was not warm. She found him austere, and his proposals for reducing royal expenditure personally inconvenient. This was not her finest political moment, and historians have noted it fairly. But it is also worth noting that her influence over Louis's decision to dismiss Turgot has been both overstated by people who wanted to blame her for everything, and understated by people defending her entirely. The reality is probably that she reflected rather than created the court's hostility to reform, which is a less dramatic story but a more accurate one. What Louis XVI did give her, with evident sincerity, was the Petit Trianon. The small chateau on the Versailles estate had been built by Louis XV for Madame de Pompadour and later used by Madame du Barry. Louis XVI transferred it to his wife shortly after becoming king, telling her in a gesture that is one of the more genuinely warm moments in their relationship that it was hers, for her to do with as she pleased. He would come when invited. She took the gift seriously. The Petit Trianon became Marie Antoinette's space in a way that nothing at Versailles proper ever was a place where she set the rules, chose the guests, and controlled, as much as anyone could control anything at Versailles, her own environment. She had the gardens redesigned in the English fashion, replacing the formal geometric arrangements with something more naturalistic. Winding paths, irregular plantings, a small lake. She commissioned small buildings for the grounds, including, later, the famous Hameau, the model farm village where she and her companions could play at pastoral simplicity with the full resources of the French crown behind the performance. The spending this involved attracted comment, including from her mother. Maria Theresa's letters from this period included repeated, increasingly pointed references to expenditure, to the gambling, to the company Marie Antoinette was keeping, and to the continuing absence of an heir. The correspondence between Vienna and Versailles had taken on a quality of sustained, affectionate pressure, the Empress loving her daughter, while simultaneously managing her as an asset whose performance needed improvement. In the spring of 1777, Maria Theresa sent the most direct intervention she could manage. She sent her son. Emperor Joseph II, Marie Antoinette's brother, and Maria Theresa's co-regent, arrived in France incognito, travelling as Count Falkenstein, theoretically a private visit, practically an inspection. He spent several weeks at Versailles and in Paris, observing everything, forming opinions about everything, and sharing those opinions with considerable directness. His assessments of his sister were honest to the point of harshness. He found her charming, he loved her, and he told her in terms that she apparently received and took seriously, that she was wasting herself on frivolities, that her political judgment was underdeveloped, that her spending was damaging her reputation, and that the absence of an heir after 7 years was a crisis that needed resolving. He is also believed to have spoken with Louis XVI about the physical dimension of the marriage. What was said in that conversation has never been fully documented, but whatever happened in its aftermath, the 7-year impasse ended. By the end of 1777, the marriage had been consummated in the full sense. By early 1778, Marie Antoinette was pregnant for the first time. The news travelled quickly to Vienna, to the French public, to the political world that had been watching the royal marriage with varying degrees of concern for years. The relief at Versailles was genuine. Maria Theresa's response from Vienna was joyful in a way her letters rarely allowed themselves to be. On December 19th, 1778, Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child. It was a girl. The baby was named Marie Thérèse Charlotte, called Madame Royale in the formal language of the court, and would be the only one of Marie Antoinette's children to survive into adulthood. The birth itself was nearly a catastrophe. The lever ceremony meant that the room filled so rapidly with courtiers pushing in to witness the royal birth that the heat and the crowd caused Marie Antoinette to faint, and Louis XVI reportedly threw open the sealed windows himself to let air into the room. The daughter was healthy. The Queen recovered, and for a brief period in the winter of 1778, the French royal family had something it had not had in years: the simple, uncomplicated appearance of things going reasonably well, Trianon, and the rumour machine. The Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's hamlet, was completed in stages through the mid-1780s on the grounds of the Petit Trianon estate, and it was exactly what it sounds like. A model village. Thatched roof cottages arranged around a small lake, a working dairy, a mill, a dovecote, carefully maintained kitchen gardens, and real farm animals kept in a state of exceptional cleanliness by a full staff of agricultural workers employed specifically for the purpose. Marie Antoinette and her companions could walk among the cottages, gather eggs, watch the cows, and experience something in the general vicinity of rural simplicity, all within a short carriage ride of the most opulent palace in Europe, and all maintained at considerable royal expense. The cows, by several accounts, were washed before the Queen visited. This is perhaps the most efficient summary of the gap between the Hameau's aesthetic and its reality that history has produced. The impulse behind it was not entirely without precedent. The vogue for artificial rusticity was a genuine 18th century fashion, rooted in Enlightenment-era idealization of the natural world and given intellectual weight by Rousseau's writings on simplicity and virtue. Aristocrats across Europe were building picturesque gardens and hermitages and model farms in the 1770s and 80s. Marie Antoinette was participating in a fashionable trend, not inventing one. But she was doing it at Versailles, in France, at a particular moment in French history, and the combination of all those factors transformed what was elsewhere a harmless aristocratic hobby into something that read, from outside the palace gates, as a statement about how the crown regarded the lives of ordinary people. The Petit Trianon itself had become, by the early 1780s, a world within a world. Marie Antoinette controlled who entered it, and notably, who did not. The elaborate ritual accessibility of Versailles proper, which required the royal family to be available to the court at almost all hours, did not apply at the Petit Trianon. She set the guest list. She determined the schedule. The people admitted were her people, her chosen circle, the inner social group that had gathered around her gradually over the previous years and whose composition was itself becoming a political problem. At the centre of that circle was Gabrielle de Polignac, the Comtesse Jules de Polignac, who had entered Marie Antoinette's orbit in the early 1770s and had become her closest companion over the following decade. Gabrielle was genuinely warm, undemanding, and easy to be fond of. These qualities were real, and Marie Antoinette's affection for her was genuine. But around Gabrielle had gathered her family and her connections, and those people were considerably less disinterested than Gabrielle herself. The Polignac circle became, over time, a mechanism through which royal favour was converted into appointments, pensions, and financial benefits, at a rate that the broader court, which had its own expectations of royal patronage, found excessive, and that the broader public found enraging. The spending on clothing had continued. Rose Bertin was still producing gowns at prices that would have been startling, even by the standards of a court accustomed to luxury. In 1783, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the most fashionable portrait painter in France, and Marie Antoinette's preferred portraitist, painted the Queen in a light muslin dress. Her hair relatively simply arranged, the overall impression considerably less formal than the usual royal portrait. The painting was displayed at the Salon in Paris and caused a scandal of its own particular kind. Critics argued that the Queen of France had been painted looking like a middle-class woman in her mourning clothes, that it was undignified, that the muslin was practically a chemise, and that the whole thing was inappropriate for a portrait of a monarch. The painting was withdrawn and replaced with something more conventional. This was one of those situations where almost every choice Marie Antoinette made was wrong in someone's eyes, too extravagant when she dressed elaborately, too casual when she dressed simply. Meanwhile, from the printing presses of Paris, and from less legitimate operations further underground, a steady stream of pamphlets and libels, illegal satirical publications, was building a parallel version of Marie Antoinette that bore a diminishing relationship to the actual person. These publications had begun circulating in the 1770s, initially focused on the gambling, the spending, the Polignac favoritism. They grew more pointed and more sexually explicit as the decade turned. They gave her the nickname Madame Deficit, connecting her spending directly to France's financial problems. The name l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, was used with a deliberate contempt, playing on the word quien in a way that no one missed. By the early 1780s, the underground press was producing material about Marie Antoinette that would not have been published about a private person, let alone a queen. The difficult truth about these publications is that they worked. They shaped public perception in ways that the court, sealed inside its own world, did not fully understand or respond to effectively. The image of Marie Antoinette constructed by the libels, extravagant, foreign, sexually transgressive, indifferent to the suffering of ordinary French people, was not accurate in most of its details. But it was coherent, it was vivid, and it filled a space that genuine information did not reach. Most French people had no direct access to Marie Antoinette. What they knew of her came through what circulated, and what circulated was increasingly hostile. November 1780 brought the death of Maria Theresa. The Empress died at the age of 63 after reigning for 40 years and managing a dynastic empire with a combination of political intelligence and personal force that had no equivalent among the rulers of her generation. The news reached Versailles and affected Marie Antoinette genuinely and deeply. The relationship between mother and daughter had been complicated. The pressure, the instructions, the management conducted across hundreds of miles of correspondence, but it had also been a real connection, sustained through years of separation. The letters had continued until the end. After November of 1780, there were no more letters from Vienna, and the thread connecting Marie Antoinette to the world she had come from became considerably thinner. On October 22nd, 1781, she gave birth to a son. He was named Louis Joseph Xavier François, and as the firstborn male child of the King of France, he became the Dauphin immediately. The birth produced genuine public celebration. The lack of a male heir had been a political vulnerability for years, and its resolution was welcomed across the full range of French opinion, from the court to the street pamphlets. For a brief moment, the hostility toward the Queen softened. She had done what queens were expected to do. A second son, Louis Charles, was born on March 27, 1785. A fourth child, a daughter named Sophie Hélène Béatrice, followed in July 1786. Sophie was fragile from birth and would die before her first birthday. In June of 1787, the first death among Marie Antoinette's children, and a grief that was private and genuine in a life where very little was permitted to be either. Through all of this, the pamphlets kept circulating. The spending kept attracting criticism. The Polignac circle kept absorbing royal patronage. And France, outside the walls of Versailles, kept accumulating the pressures that the court's internal life gave it very little apparatus to detect. The reputation that was being constructed in print, through rumour and repetition, and the specific energy that resentment generates when it finds a clear target, was moving steadily away from the woman who actually existed, and moving in a direction from which it would prove very difficult to return. The diamond necklace scandal. The necklace had never belonged to Marie Antoinette. She had never worn it, never ordered it, never held it in her hands. It had been designed for someone else entirely, rejected by her deliberately, and used as the instrument of an elaborate fraud that she had no part in constructing. None of this would ultimately matter much, because by the time the full story reached the French public, the damage was already running in a direction that facts alone could not reverse. The origins of the affair went back to the final years of Louis XV's reign. The Parisian jewellers Baumer and Bassenge had spent years assembling an extraordinary necklace, a construction of 647 diamonds, weighing approximately 2,800 carats. Arranged in multiple strands with festoons, pendants and tassels, the entire piece valued at 1,600,000 livres. The design had been commissioned with Madame du Barry in mind as the eventual buyer. Louis XV died before the purchase was completed, and the jewellers were left holding a piece of extraordinary value with no obvious buyer, because almost no one in Europe could afford it. They approached Marie Antoinette on several occasions. She declined. Louis XVI offered to buy it for her at least once, and she declined that offer too, saying that France needed ships more than she needed diamonds, which was genuinely true and also made for a better story than the historical record usually provides about her. The jewellers were growing desperate. The capital tied up in the necklace was threatening their business. Into this situation came Cardinal Louis de Rohan, Grand Almoner of France, one of the most powerful clerics in the kingdom, and a man with a specific and long-standing problem. Years earlier, while serving as French ambassador to Vienna, he had written letters about Maria Theresa that were privately mocking and had been intercepted and shown to the Empress. Maria Theresa had complained to Versailles, and the resulting coolness had followed him back to France in the form of Marie Antoinette's consistent refusal to acknowledge him at court. He had been working ever since to restore himself to royal favour, and he had not succeeded. Then he encountered Jeanne de la Motte Valois. Jeanne was a woman of genuine resourcefulness and essentially no scruples, who had constructed for herself an identity as the descendant of an illegitimate Valois bloodline, and had used this claim to work her way into the edges of the court social world. She presented herself to Rohan as someone with access to Marie Antoinette, a claim that was entirely false, but which Rohan wanted badly enough to believe. She began producing letters, supposedly from the Queen, expressing a softening attitude toward the cardinal and suggesting that with careful management, his restoration to royal favour might be achievable. The letters were forgeries, produced by a man named Retaux de Villette, who replicated the Queen's handwriting with sufficient skill to pass Rohan's scrutiny. The cardinal, reading what he wanted to read, accepted them. The correspondence escalated until Jeanne arranged what she told him would be a brief, discreet meeting with the Queen in the gardens of Versailles at night, in the dark, in a grove of trees, carefully limited in duration to avoid attracting attention. The woman who appeared in the garden and briefly played the role of Marie Antoinette was named Nicole de Lever, a young woman from Paris who bore a passing physical resemblance to the Queen, had been recruited for the purpose, given appropriate clothing, and instructed to say very little. The meeting lasted only a few minutes. Rohan, in the darkness and the emotion of the moment, did not look closely enough. He came away believing he had met with the Queen of France in secret, that his rehabilitation was progressing, and that he was, going forward, operating with royal blessing. Jeanne then told him that the Queen wished to acquire the diamond necklace through an intermediary, that she wanted it but did not wish the purchase associated with her publicly, given the political sensitivity of a major royal expenditure at a time when France's finances were under scrutiny. Rohan, now thoroughly committed to a fiction he had invested considerable hope in, agreed to serve as that intermediary. In January of 1785, he took delivery of the necklace from Baume and Bassenge, signed papers, accepting responsibility for the payments, and passed the necklace to a man presented to him as the Queen's representative. The necklace disappeared into London and Paris, broken apart and sold stone by stone and section by section by Jeanne and her husband Nicolas de la Motte. The first payment instalment came due in August of 1785, and nothing arrived. Baume and Bassenge, alarmed, approached the Queen directly. Marie Antoinette had no idea what they were talking about. The fraud surfaced almost immediately once that conversation happened. What Louis XVI did next shaped everything that followed. Rather than managing the affair quietly, which would have limited the damage but left Rohan's role unaddressed, the king decided on a public arrest. On August 15, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, a day when the full court assembled at Versailles in ceremonial dress, Cardinal Rohan was arrested in the Hall of Mirrors. The choice of day and location was deliberate. Louis wanted it visible, on the record, and unambiguous. The strategy backfired. Rohan was a prince of the church, a member of one of France's most powerful aristocratic families, and an institution in his own right. His public arrest, rather than signalling the Crown's decisive response to fraud, became the focus of a debate about whether the king had the right to treat a cardinal in this manner. His family mobilised, his legal team prepared. The case went to the Parliament of Paris for trial. The trial that ran through the spring of 1786 was one of the great public spectacles of the pre-revolutionary period. Every detail circulated through Paris. The forged letters, the garden meeting, the fake queen in the darkness, the missing diamonds. Jeanne de la Motte was convicted, sentenced to public flogging, branded on both shoulders with the letter V for volus, thief, and imprisoned. Her husband had already fled to England. Retaux de Villette was banished. Nicole de Lever, whose role was judged to have been that of a naive participant rather than an architect of the scheme, was acquitted. Cardinal Rohan was also acquitted. The Parliament's verdict on Rohan was read by the public not primarily as a legal judgment, but as a political one, an expression of the court's view that the charges against him were insufficient, or that the Crown had mishandled the affair from the beginning. For Marie Antoinette, who was entirely innocent of any involvement in the actual fraud, the acquittal landed as a particular cruelty. It implicitly suggested that Rohan's belief in the forged letters was understandable, that a version of Marie Antoinette, capable of conducting secret garden meetings and arranging covert necklace purchases, was plausible enough, that a reasonable man might have been deceived by a very rough approximation of one. Jeanne de la Motte, who eventually escaped from prison and made her way to London, spent the following years producing memoirs that portrayed Marie Antoinette as an active participant in the entire scheme. The memoirs were read widely, believed by people who were already inclined to believe the worst, and contributed to a growing body of published accusation that the Queen had no effective mechanism to counter. She could not sue a pamphlet. She could not publicly debate a forged letter. She could only deny, and denial from inside Versailles reached the people least inclined to accept it. The diamond necklace affair cost Marie Antoinette something more fundamental than reputation. It cost her the residual benefit of the doubt. The public goodwill that had greeted the births of her children, that had survived the Polignac criticism and the fashion extravagances, did not survive this. The story was too complicated to summarize accurately in a pamphlet, and too complicated for most people to follow in its actual details. What survived in popular memory was simpler and more damaging: a necklace, the Queen's name attached to it, and a verdict that seemed to say the accusation was not entirely unreasonable. The walls begin to crack. France's financial situation, which had been serious throughout the 1770s and early 1780s, crossed into something closer to critical in the years following the diamond necklace affair. The cost of supporting the American Revolution France had entered the conflict in 1778, providing money, ships, and troops to the American colonists as a way of weakening Britain had added significantly to a debt that was already substantial. By 1786, the Controller General Charles Alexandre de Calonne presented Louis XVI with an assessment that was blunt. France was spending considerably more than it was collecting. The gap was growing, and the existing structure of taxation which exempted the nobility and clergy, who held most of France's wealth, could not be maintained without systemic reform. The proposed solution was a universal land tax that would apply to all property regardless of the owner's rank. It was not a new idea. Turgot had attempted something similar a decade earlier. The political problem was identical. The people who would have to pay it were the people with the most power to resist it. Calonne convened an assembly of notables in February 1787, an advisory body of senior nobles and officials to build support for the reforms before presenting them to the parliaments. The notables refused. They argued procedural objections, questioned Calonne's figures, and generally behaved as bodies of privileged people tend to behave when asked to surrender privilege. Calonne was dismissed. His replacement, the Archbishop of Toulouse Loménie de Brienne, tried a modified version of the same programme and encountered the same resistance. The parliaments refused to register the new tax edicts. Louis dismissed the parliaments. The parliaments accused the king of despotism. The public, which had no particular love for the parliaments either, found itself in the unusual position of watching two branches of the old order fighting each other, while the country's finances deteriorated beneath both of them. Then the harvest failed. The summer of 1788 produced one of the worst harvests France had seen in living memory. A severe hailstorm in July destroyed crops across wide areas of the country. The autumn harvest was poor. And then the winter that followed, the winter of 1788 into 1789, was one of the coldest of the century. A sustained freeze that damaged whatever had survived and made the roads impassable for weeks at a time, disrupting the distribution of what grain did exist. By the early months of 1789, bread prices in Paris had reached levels that consumed between 80 and 90% of a working family's daily wages, leaving almost nothing for rent, clothing, or anything else. The people who experienced this winter were not abstract historical forces. They were specific human beings: bakers, seamstresses, day labourers, market vendors, who went to sleep hungry and woke up calculating whether today's earnings would cover today's bread, in a city where the pamphlets circulating through the streets described a queen who had spent more on a single gown than most of them would earn in a year. The connection between the court's extravagance and the people's suffering was not a precise economic analysis. It was simpler and more powerful than that. It was a feeling about where the country's resources were going and who they were going toward. Louis XVI, pushed beyond the point where any other option was available, agreed to convene the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not met since 1614. Elections were held across France for delegates representing the three estates, clergy, nobility, and the Third Estate, which contained everyone else. The process of electing delegates also produced the Cahiers de doléances, notebooks of grievances compiled at the local level, in which ordinary French people wrote down what was wrong with their lives and what they wanted changed. The Cahiers are one of the most remarkable documents of the period, precisely because they are not written by politicians or philosophers but by farmers, craftsmen, and shopkeepers describing their actual circumstances in their own language. Marie Antoinette's position during these months was complicated by both external events and private grief. On June 4th, 1789, just as the Estates General was convening at Versailles and the political temperature was rising daily, the Dauphin Louis-Joseph died. He was 7 years old and had been visibly ill for months, wasting from what was understood at the time to be tuberculosis of the spine. His parents had watched him deteriorate slowly through the preceding year, and his death, when it came, was not a surprise, and was not any less painful for being expected. Marie Antoinette's grief was genuine. The court's mourning was formal, and the Estates General, the newspapers, and the political developments happening a short distance away did not pause. The Estates General had convened on May 5th. Within weeks, the meeting had broken down along the lines of a fundamental disagreement about how voting would be conducted, whether each estate would vote as a bloc or whether the assembly would vote by head count, which would give the larger Third Estate effective majority. The Third Estate, joined by sympathetic clergy and liberal nobles, declared itself the National Assembly on June 17th and pledged, in the tennis court oath of June 20th, not to dissolve until France had a constitution. Louis XVI's response moved between firmness and retreat in the pattern that had characterized his reign from the beginning. He declared the National Assembly illegal, then effectively recognized it. He dismissed his finance minister Necker on July 11th. Necker was popular with the Paris public, and his dismissal was read as a sign that the king was preparing to use military force against the Assembly. On July 14th, 1789, a crowd in Paris stormed the Bastille fortress, killed its governor, and freed its handful of prisoners. The Bastille was not at that moment a significant prison. It held 7 inmates, but as a symbol of royal authority it was total, and its fall sent a signal across France that reverberated in ways that no one standing outside its walls that morning fully anticipated. That evening, Louis XVI wrote in his personal diary. He kept the diary in the format of a hunting record, a daily notation of activity and outcome. For July 14th, 1789, the entry read, Rien, nothing. He had not gone hunting that day, and in the language of his diary, a day without a hunt was recorded as a day without content. Whether he wrote the entry before hearing the news from Paris or after has been debated. Either way, the notation stands in the historical record as a peculiarly precise expression of a man whose inner register simply did not correspond to the scale of what was happening around him. Marie Antoinette had pushed for a firmer response to the Assembly from the beginning, and had been among the voices urging the king not to yield ground. She was not wrong that yielding had costs. She was also not right that firmness, in the specific conditions of 1789, had any realistic prospect of success. The situation had moved past the point where the tools she understood, court politics, royal authority, diplomatic pressure, were the relevant ones. What was being assembled outside Versailles was not a court faction. It was something none of them, inside the palace had adequate language for yet. The October days and the fall of Versailles, the summer of 1789, did not resolve the crisis. It deepened it. The National Assembly was now a functioning reality, meeting at Versailles and producing legislation at a pace that dismantled the legal structure of the old order with remarkable speed. In August, the Assembly passed the August Decrees, which abolished feudal privileges, ended serfdom, eliminated the tithe, and removed most of the legal distinctions between social classes that had defined French society for centuries. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen followed a document that laid out principles of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty in terms that were clear enough to be understood and radical enough to be genuinely threatening to a monarchical system built on opposite premises. Louis XVI's relationship to all of this was a sustained reluctance. He had not called the Estates General to dismantle the monarchy. He had called it to solve a budget problem, and what had arrived instead was a political transformation he neither wanted nor knew how to stop. He signed what was placed before him under pressure, delayed what he could, and quietly sent letters to foreign rulers, including his Habsburg relatives, describing his situation in terms that left little ambiguity about his view of the Assembly's legitimacy. Marie Antoinette was more direct in her opposition, at least in private. Her correspondence from this period, particularly through the Austrian ambassador Mercy Argenteau, made clear that she regarded the Assembly's actions as fundamentally illegitimate, and that she hoped for some form of external intervention that would restore the Crown's authority. This was not a politically achievable position in the summer of 1789, but it was an honest one, and it reflected the essential gap between where the revolution was going and where the royal family believed it should go. Meanwhile, in Paris, the bread prices remained punishing. The harvest of 1789 was better than the previous year, but better did not mean sufficient, and the improvement in the fields had not yet reached the bakeries in the quantities needed. The city remained volatile. The political excitement of the summer had given people a language for their grievances that was more precise than it had been before they knew now that the Declaration of the Rights of Man existed, that the feudal system had been legally abolished, that the Assembly was claiming authority over the king's decisions. What they also knew was that bread was still expensive and that the royal family was still at Versailles, 12 miles away, in a palace that most of them had never seen and could not begin to imagine. The specific trigger for what happened in October was a banquet. On October 1st, 1789, Louis XVI welcomed a regiment of soldiers to Versailles, and a dinner was held in the opera house of the palace for the officers. By the reports that reached Paris in the following days, the banquet had been excessive, the mood had been royalist, and at some point during the evening the tricolour cockade, the symbol of the revolution, worn as a badge by almost everyone in Paris who wished to signal their political alignment, had been stepped on or discarded. Whether the specific details of that account were accurate is less important than the fact that by October 3rd and 4th, the streets of Paris were running with the story, and the story arrived in a city that was already angry. On the morning of October 5th, the market women of Paris, the fishwives, the market vendors, the women who worked the stalls at Les Halles, and who had been navigating the bread shortage at the most immediate possible level, assembled and began to march. They gathered weapons as they went, pikes, pitchforks, whatever was available, and by the time the column left the city, it numbered somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 people, moving along the 12 miles of road between Paris and Versailles in the rain of an October morning. They were not a military force in any organised sense, but they were not a disorganised mob either. They had a destination, and they had a purpose. They arrived at Versailles in the late afternoon. The palace gates were closed but not defensible against this kind of pressure, and by evening a delegation of women had been admitted to speak with Louis XVI. He received them, promised that bread would be made available and sent to Paris, and signed the Declaration of Rights that he had been delaying. The delegation returned to the crowd with what appeared to be a reasonable outcome. The crowd, soaking and cold and not entirely satisfied, camped outside the palace walls through the night. Louis XVI, that evening, discussed leaving Versailles with his advisers. He had carriages readied and then decided against departure. This decision to stay rather than leave while leaving was still possible was one of the more consequential hesitations of his reign. In the early hours of October 6th, a group from the crowd found an unguarded entrance to the palace and broke through. They moved through the corridors of the state apartments toward the Queen's bedchamber. 2 of her bodyguards were killed defending the door. Marie Antoinette, woken by the sound of the intrusion and the warnings of her surviving attendants, fled through a hidden passage that connected her bedroom directly to the king's apartments. She arrived with no shoes, wearing only a dressing gown, and reached Louis just ahead of the crowd breaking through behind her. What followed in the next hour or so was managed partly by the arrival of General Lafayette and the National Guard, who interposed themselves between the crowd and the royal family, and partly by the crowd's own transition from violence to demand. What they wanted now was visible. The royal family in Paris. Not in Versailles, 12 miles away, behind gates that could be opened or forced. In Paris, where they could be seen and, if necessary, reached. The appearance on the balcony came in the morning. Louis and Marie Antoinette stepped out before the assembled crowd in the courtyard below, a crowd that had, somewhere in its recent past, killed 2 men and that was now calling for them to come to Paris. Marie Antoinette stepped forward at one point and stood alone, without Louis, without the children, in front of the crowd. She made a formal bow. By several accounts, including hostile ones, it was a composed moment, a woman facing a crowd that was prepared to harm her and choosing to stand still rather than retreat. Lafayette, whose position throughout these events was the complicated one of a man trying to manage a revolution he had helped start without losing either the crown or the mob, stepped onto the balcony and kissed her hand. It was a gesture calculated for the crowd, and it worked as far as it went, which was far enough to get through the morning without further bloodshed. By early afternoon of October 6th, the royal family was in carriages. The procession that left Versailles that day was unlike anything that had been seen on that road before. The royal coaches moved through a column that included National Guard soldiers, the women who had marched the previous morning, and people carrying on long poles the heads of the 2 guards who had been killed in the night. It took hours. The royal children were in the carriages. It rained. They arrived at the Tuileries Palace in central Paris late that night. The Tuileries had not been used as a regular royal residence for decades. The rooms were dusty, the furniture was inadequate, and the apartments hastily assigned to the royal family were a considerable reduction from the scale of Versailles in every measurable dimension. Louis XVI, walking through the rooms on arrival, said something to the effect that everything was very fine, a statement so far from descriptive accuracy that it seems less like denial and more like the kind of thing a person says when they have run out of language for what has actually happened. Versailles, which had been the centre of French royal life for nearly a century, would never be inhabited by a French monarch again. The palace did not disappear. It was maintained, used for assembly sessions, preserved. But the world it had been designed to house was gone from the moment those carriages rolled out of the courtyard on the afternoon of October 6th. The Gilded machine had been running for a long time on ceremony, hierarchy, and the assumption that the distance between Versailles and Paris was a permanent condition rather than a 12-mile road. Prisoners in the palace. The Tuileries was a palace in the architectural sense, and a prison in the practical one. The building sat on the right bank of the Seine in central Paris, connected to the Louvre complex, surrounded by gardens that were open to the public, which meant that, from the day the royal family arrived in October 1789, ordinary Parisians could walk through the grounds and observe their king and queen at a distance that would have been unimaginable at Versailles. The revolution had not removed the spectacle of royalty. It had relocated it and changed the terms under which it operated. The court had once watched Marie Antoinette dress, Now the city watched her walk. National Guard soldiers were posted at every exit. Requests to leave the palace grounds required approval. The family's movements were tracked, reported on, and discussed in the newspapers that had multiplied across Paris in the preceding months with the energy of a press freed from the censorship that had previously governed it. By the end of 1789, there were well over 300 newspapers operating in Paris alone, ranging from careful political analysis to publications whose primary purpose was the daily generation of outrage. Marie Antoinette appeared in most of them regularly, and the portrait was rarely sympathetic. The adjustment from Versailles was jarring in ways that went beyond the physical. At Versailles, the elaborate ritual of the court had been suffocating, but it had also been ordered everyone knew their position. The day followed a known sequence, and the rules, however absurd, were consistent. The Tuileries had no such structure. The household was reduced. The ceremonial apparatus had been stripped down. The people around the royal family were fewer and less dependable, and the sense of being watched had changed its character from the attentive observation of courtiers to something closer to surveillance. Louis XVI adapted to this new reality in the way he adapted to most things slowly, and by finding the tasks within it he could actually perform. He met with the Assembly's ministers. He signed legislation. He attended the sessions required of a constitutional monarch. Outwardly, through much of 1790, he projected a cooperation with the revolution that was not entirely genuine. He told the Assembly what it needed to hear. He told his private correspondents something considerably different. Marie Antoinette was doing the same, and with more organisation. The Austrian ambassador, Mercy Argenteau, who had been reporting to Vienna on her behalf since her arrival in France 20 years earlier, remained a channel for her private communications. She also corresponded through the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who had been a figure in the social world of Versailles since the 1770s, and whose relationship with the Queen had deepened, through these years of crisis, into something that was clearly more than diplomatic courtesy. Fersen was discreet, loyal, and practically useful. He would eventually play a central role in the escape attempt that was already beginning to take shape in these months. In the meantime, his letters and hers moved between Paris and the courts of Europe with the careful indirection that the situation required. The content of these private communications was, from the revolution's perspective, precisely what its most suspicious voices suspected. Marie Antoinette was describing the political situation honestly. The royal family was not free. The king's cooperation with the Assembly was compelled rather than voluntary, and the situation required outside intervention to be resolved. She appealed to her brother Joseph, and after Joseph's death in February 1790, to her nephew Emperor Leopold II. She wrote to the King of Spain, to the Queen of Naples, to anyone whose position and resources might translate into the kind of diplomatic or military pressure that could reverse the direction France was heading. None of this intervention materialized in the immediate term, and the letters, had they been intercepted and published, would have confirmed every accusation the pamphlets had ever made about the Austrian woman working against France. They were not intercepted, not yet, but they existed, and their existence was a measure of how completely Marie Antoinette had concluded that the constitutional process was not a solution. The event that most clearly demonstrated the depth of the problem was the civil constitution of the clergy, passed by the National Assembly in July 1790. The legislation restructured the French Catholic Church as a state institution, required clergy to swear loyalty oaths to the Constitution, and effectively broke the Church's connection to Rome. For the majority of the Assembly's members, this was a logical extension of revolutionary principles. The Church owned vast property, exercised independent authority, and represented a source of institutional power that the Revolution had placed on its list of things requiring reorganization. For Louis XVI, who was genuinely devout in a private and uncomplicated way, signing the civil constitution created a crisis of conscience he never resolved. He did sign it, and he did sign the loyalty oath required of him as a constitutional monarch. He also sent private confessions to Rome expressing his distress at having done so, and began hearing mass from non-juring priests, clergy, who had refused the constitutional oath whenever he could arrange it without detection. The split between his public compliance and his private conscience was total, and it produced a man whose grip on any coherent political position had become almost impossible to locate. July 14th, 1790. The first anniversary of the Bastille was marked by the Festival of Federation, a vast public ceremony held on the Champ de Mars in Paris. Hundreds of thousands of people attended. Louis XVI stood before the crowd and took the oath to the Constitution in front of the assembled delegates of the National Guard from across France, amid a genuine atmosphere of popular enthusiasm. Lafayette organised the ceremony. Talleyrand said the outdoor mass. It was designed and experienced by many who were there as a moment of national reconciliation, the king embracing the revolution, France moving forward together. Marie Antoinette stood on the reviewing platform in the rain and watched. She wrote to Mercy Argenteau shortly afterward that the festival had been impressive, and that she and the king had been well received, and that none of it changed anything about the underlying situation, which she continued to describe as one of captivity awaiting rescue. The man who might have served as a bridge between the court and the more moderate elements of the assembly, the orator, Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, who had secretly been advising the royal family and accepting payment from the crown while maintaining his revolutionary credentials, died in April 1791. He was 42 years old and had been the most compelling speaker in the assembly, and the most creative thinker about how a constitutional monarchy might actually function in France. His death removed the one figure who had a foot in both worlds, and who might conceivably have helped negotiate the distance between them. The assembly mourned him publicly. The court mourned him privately and for different reasons. His absence was felt almost immediately. In April 1791, the royal family attempted to travel to the chateau of St. Cloud for the Easter holiday, a trip that would have allowed Louis to hear Mass from a non-juring priest, which he could not easily manage in Paris. The carriages were prepared. The family came out to the courtyard of the Tuileries. The crowd assembled outside and blocked the gates, refusing to let the carriages pass for nearly 2 hours. Lafayette arrived and attempted to clear the way. The crowd did not move. The royal family returned inside. The King of France could not leave his own courtyard. It was a demonstration, clearer than almost anything that had happened since October 1789, of what constitutional monarchy had come to mean in practice. The constitutional protections that theoretically guaranteed the king's freedoms were paper ones. The actual condition of the royal family was determined by whether the crowd outside the gate felt like allowing something to happen. The escape plan, which had been discussed in correspondence and then in private conversation over the preceding months, moved from theoretical to urgent. Fersen began making concrete arrangements. Routes were studied. Documents were prepared. A large Berline carriage was ordered travelling in some degree of comfort, it was decided, rather than in the stripped-down simplicity that might have moved faster and attracted less attention. This decision would matter. The flight to Varennes. The plan had been in preparation for months. Axel von Fersen coordinated the logistics, studying maps, arranging relay horses at post stations along the route, obtaining travel documents in false names, and commissioning the carriage that would carry the royal family from Paris to the northeastern frontier. The destination was the town of Montmédy, near the border with the Austrian Netherlands, where the Marquis de Bouillé commanded a force of loyal troops. Once the royal family reached Montmédy, they would be under military protection, close enough to the border to be safely out of reach of Paris, and in a position to negotiate from something resembling a position of strength for the first time since 1789. The carriage Fersen ordered was a Berline, a large, well-sprung, enclosed travelling coach of the kind used by wealthy families making long journeys in comfort. It was well built and well equipped. It had space for several passengers and their luggage. It also had a built-in food storage compartment, a wine supply, and a toilet arrangement, because whoever made the decision about the carriage seems to have concluded that the comfort of the journey mattered more than its speed or inconspicuousness. The berline was not a discreet vehicle. It was the kind of carriage that attracted attention on provincial roads because it was clearly expensive and because it moved like something that belonged to someone important, which it did, though not in the way anyone was supposed to know. This choice would contribute directly to what happened next. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family made their way out of the Tuileries in stages and in disguise. Marie Antoinette left her apartments in the guise of a governess, passing through corridors she had walked hundreds of times in a plain dress and a hat, moving carefully to avoid the guards whose attention a sound or a misplaced step might attract. Louis XVI left separately, dressed as a valet, and took a wrong turn in the dark near the palace courtyard, adding several minutes of confusion to a departure that was already running late. The children were bundled out with their aunt, the king's sister Madame Elizabeth, also in plain clothes. Fersen himself, disguised as a coachman, drove the first carriage that collected them from the arranged point near the palace. He brought them through Paris in the early hours of the morning and handed them to the large berline waiting on the road outside the city. He intended to accompany them further, but the plan called for him to separate from the party at a certain point to avoid drawing attention to the group. He said goodbye somewhere along the route in the dark hours before dawn. He and Marie Antoinette would never see each other again. The royal family were travelling under the name of the Korff household, a fiction based on papers belonging to a Russian baroness, arranged through diplomatic channels. Marie Antoinette was listed as Madame Rocher, governess to the children. Louis was recorded as the steward, Monsieur Durand. The children were the baroness's children. It was a serviceable fiction for a dark road in the early morning, and it would not survive daylight and the attention of anyone who looked carefully. The first problem was time. They were supposed to depart considerably earlier in the evening, and had lost several hours between one delay and another. The relay troops that Bouillet had positioned along the route at various points, small units of cavalry waiting at specific towns to provide escort, as the carriage moved through, had been given a window of time in which to wait. When the carriage had not appeared by the end of that window, the unit commanders concluded the plan had been cancelled and withdrew their men, some of them trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves by lingering too long in one place. As the berline rolled through town after town in the daylight of June 21st, the escort that was supposed to be there was not. The carriage crossed the country through a long midsummer day. Inside it were the King and Queen of France, their two surviving children, Madame Elizabeth, and the governess, Madame de Tourzel, crowded together in a vehicle that was comfortable by any standard of the time, and at the same time entirely insufficient cover for who was actually in it. Louis's face was on the paper currency circulating across France, the assignats, which meant that anyone who handled money regularly and looked at the man sitting inside this expensive carriage had reasonable material for comparison. At Saint-Menehould, a town in the Champagne region, the postmaster who arranged the relay horses was a man named Jean-Baptiste Drouet. He looked at the passengers as the carriage stopped. He looked again. He had seen the king's face on the assignats enough times to carry a working impression of it. He said nothing at the stop, completed the business of changing the horses, and watched the berline roll away. Then he got on a horse himself and took a faster road to the next significant town, riding through the evening with something to say when he arrived. The town ahead was Varennes. The berline reached Varennes at around 11 at night on June 21st. The town was waiting for it. Drouet had arrived ahead and alerted the local officials, and a group of citizens had positioned a cart across the narrow bridge over the River Aire that the carriage needed to cross. The driver stopped. The passengers were asked to identify themselves. The local procurator, a grocer named Jean-Baptiste Sauce, came to examine the documents. The documents were technically in order. The faces of the people presenting them were not quite matching the story those documents told. A former bodyguard of the king, who happened to be in Varennes, recognized Louis despite the valet's clothes and said so. By midnight, the royal family had been identified and was being held in the rooms above Sauce's grocery shop, while Varennes woke up around them, and news travelled outward in every direction simultaneously. Bouillet's troops were 30 miles away at Stenay. By the time word reached them and they could have moved, it was already too late for that kind of solution. Commissioners sent by the National Assembly, including Antoine Barnave and Jérôme Pession, arrived on June 22nd and oversaw the return. The journey back to Paris took 4 days, covering the same roads in reverse, and the difference in atmosphere between the outward journey and the return was total. Enormous crowds gathered at every town they passed through. They stood mostly silent, which was its own statement. By long-standing custom, French subjects removed their hats in the presence of royalty. The crowds that lined the roads for the return from Varennes kept their hats on. Barnave, riding inside the carriage with the royal family for part of the return journey, spoke at length with Marie Antoinette and came away with what appears to have been genuine sympathy for her personal situation, along with a clear-eyed understanding of how much damage the flight had done. He would correspond with her privately for several months after Varennes, attempting to construct some moderate path through the political landscape. Another bridge builder who lacked the material to build the bridge he was imagining. The political consequences of Varennes settled over France within days. The pretense that Louis XVI was voluntarily cooperating with the constitutional process was finished. He had tried to flee. His letters left behind at the Tuileries, explaining his departure, made clear what he thought of the revolution and the constraints it had placed on him. The Assembly suspended his powers temporarily while it decided what to do with a king who had attempted to abandon his kingdom. Republican voices, which had been present but minority before Varennes, grew considerably louder afterward. The Cordeliers Club organised a petition calling for the establishment of a republic. On July 17th, 1791, the National Guard under Lafayette fired on the crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars to sign the petition, killing a number of people in what became known as the Champ de Mars massacre. The moderate constitutional project was trying to hold the centre by force, and the force was making the centre harder to hold. Louis was eventually restored to formal power under a new, more restrictive constitution in September 1791. He took the oath again. The Assembly declared the matter resolved. Almost no one believed it. The Temple and the trial. The period between Varennes and the fall of the monarchy was a year in which the political ground kept shifting faster than any stable position could be established on it. The Legislative Assembly that replaced the National Assembly in October 1791 contained a different distribution of forces. The moderate constitutionalists who had dominated the First Assembly were less prominent, the more radical Girondin and Jacobin factions more so, and the general direction of travel was clearly leftward in ways that made the constitutional monarchy's survival increasingly theoretical. The war changed everything again. France declared war on Austria in April 1792, and the declaration was supported across much of the political spectrum for different reasons. Radicals wanted to spread revolutionary principles. Girondins believed war would consolidate the revolution, and the king and queen privately hoped that an Austrian military intervention would restore their position. The early months of the war went badly for France. The army was disorganised, its officer corps had been depleted by emigration, and the initial campaigns were defeated or abandoned in confusion. Paris interpreted the military failures as evidence of treason, and the court was the most obvious place to look for traitors. The Brunswick Manifesto, issued in July 1792 by the commander of the Austro-Prussian forces advancing toward France, was designed to protect the royal family by threatening Paris with destruction if any harm came to them. It produced the opposite effect, with the reliability of a political miscalculation textbook. Rather than intimidating the city into caution, it confirmed for much of the Paris population that the king and queen were coordinating with the foreign armies advancing on French soil. The manifesto that was supposed to protect them made them more dangerous to protect. On August 10th, 1792, a crowd backed by the radical sections of Paris stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss guards who defended the palace fought and were killed, several hundred of them massacred in the courtyard and the rooms. The royal family, warned that the attack was coming, had already left the palace and taken refuge in the Legislative Assembly. Sitting in the reporter's box, while the assembly debated what to do and the sounds of fighting carried from outside. Louis XVI was suspended from his functions as king that day. Within days, the family was transferred to the Temple. The Temple was a medieval tower complex in the northern part of Paris, originally built by the Knights Templar in the 13th century and maintained over the intervening centuries as a fortress of considerable solidity. It was chosen as a prison precisely because it was old, thick-walled, and difficult to exit without authorization. The Revolutionary Committee could have chosen a more comfortable location, but comfort was no longer the point. The royal family arrived with a reduced household, a few servants, the governess Madame de Tourzel briefly, and settled into quarters that were cramped by any standard they had previously known, and comfortable by the standard of what was coming. They were still together, which was something. Louis and Marie Antoinette, their daughter Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, and their son Louis Charles, and Madame Elizabeth, occupied the tower through the late summer and autumn of 1792. Louis was allowed books. He continued the children's lessons himself, reading history, geography, Latin. The family ate together, spent time together in the small rooms available to them. The conditions were restricted, the surveillance was constant, and the outside world arrived through the newspapers that were occasionally permitted to reach them. On September 21st, 1792, the monarchy was formally abolished. France was declared a republic. Louis Auguste Capet. That was the name the republic used for the man who had been Louis XVI, was now a private citizen facing trial. The trial proceedings began in December. The charges covered his actions throughout the revolution, the vetoes, the correspondence with foreign powers, the flight to Varennes, the events of August 10th. He was allowed counsel and conducted himself at trial with a dignity that some observers noted and others dismissed as irrelevant to the outcome. On January 20th, 1793, the National Convention voted on the verdict and the sentence. The vote on guilt was near unanimous. The vote on execution was closer, 361 for death without condition, a significant minority for imprisonment or conditional sentence, and 72 for death with a reprieve. The conditions were not met, and the reprieve did not pass. Louis XVI was executed by guillotine on January 21st, 1793, at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Marie Antoinette was told of her husband's death through the sounds from outside and the changed behaviour of her guards. She was not permitted to see him before the execution. His final letter, written to her and Madame Elizabeth, took days to reach them, and was not delivered while he was alive. She went into mourning in the way available to her in the Temple, wearing black in a room with no ceremony, among children who were also absorbing what had happened. The months between Louis's execution and her own trial were among the most damaging of her imprisonment. In July 1793, the Committee of Public Safety decided to separate Louis Charles from his mother. The boy was 6 years old. The stated reason was that he needed to be educated as a Republican citizen, away from royalist influence. He was moved to the room below hers in the tower and placed under the supervision of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was tasked with his Republican re-education. Marie Antoinette could hear her son through the floors of the tower for some time after the separation, and then the distance increased and that stopped too. On August 2nd, 1793, she was transferred from the Temple to the Conciergerie, the prison on the Ile de la Cité that occupied part of what had been, centuries earlier, the royal palace of the Capetian kings. The building retained its Gothic towers and its medieval bones, while functioning now as an anteroom to the guillotine, housing those awaiting trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was called, among the prisoners who passed through it, the waiting room of death. Marie Antoinette spent 76 days there. Her cell was small, damp, and watched at all times. A guard was stationed inside the room itself, which allowed no privacy of any kind. Her hair, which had been powdered white through fashion in earlier years, had turned naturally white from stress. She was 37 years old and had the appearance, by accounts from those who saw her, of someone considerably older. The trial opened on October 14, 1793, before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The charges were extensive treason, correspondence with the enemy, conspiring against the security of France, draining the treasury. The public prosecutor Herman and the prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville pressed through a list of accusations that covered essentially every criticism that had ever been published about her, assembled now into formal charges. The trial was not designed to produce a genuine examination of evidence. The outcome was understood before the proceedings began. The most damaging moment came when the accusation was raised, apparently sourced from statements attributed to the young Louis Charles during the period of his re-education, that Marie Antoinette had committed sexual acts with her own son. The accusation was fabricated, and historians have concluded with considerable unanimity that whatever words came from the child were produced under adult pressure and coaching. Marie Antoinette responded to the charge by appealing directly to every mother in the room, saying that nature itself recoiled from such an accusation, and that any mother present would understand why she could not answer it. The response moved several people in the courtroom visibly, including some who were not there in her support. It did not move the outcome. The verdict was guilty on all charges. The sentence was death. She was returned to her cell that night. She had been awake for the better part of 2 days. In the early hours of October 16th, she wrote a letter to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law, still alive at that point and imprisoned separately. The letter was calm, composed, and clear. It addressed her children directly, told them she hoped they would stay together and take care of each other, expressed regret for any pain her actions had caused, and asked her daughter to forgive her brother for whatever he may have said against her during his time with Simon. The letter was confiscated by the authorities and never delivered to Madame Elizabeth. It survived in the Revolutionary archives and was published much later. She asked for scissors and thread to repair the black dress she would wear in the morning, and then she lay down on her cot in the room where a guard sat watching and waited for the day. The tumbril and the after-image. The morning of October 16th, 1793, began early. Marie Antoinette was woken before dawn, dressed herself with the help available to her in the conciergerie cell, and put on the white dress she had chosen, white being the colour of mourning in the French royal tradition. Her hair had been cut short at the back of her neck by the executioner's assistant, a practical preparation for what the guillotine required. The white cap she wore covered the rest of it. She was 37 years old. The route from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution was roughly 1.5 miles through the centre of Paris. The vehicle was an open tumbril, a simple wooden cart used for transporting the condemned. Nothing enclosed, nothing that offered any barrier between the passenger and the crowd lining every street along the way. At Versailles, the royal family had travelled in gilded carriages through crowds that kept a respectful distance. This was the same city in a different world, and the distance between those two facts was the whole of the revolution expressed in a single journey. She sat in the cart with her hands bound behind her. The priest who accompanied her was a constitutional clergyman, a juring priest who had taken the oath the church in Rome had condemned, and she accepted his presence while being unable to accept his full religious authority, given her private convictions. The cart moved through the streets at walking pace. The crowds that watched were thick. The reaction was mixed in a way that the simplified version of this story often loses. There were people in those crowds who watched in silence, people who shouted, people who wept, and people who simply looked, which is its own category of response. An artist named Jacques-Louis David sketched her in the cart as it passed, a rough, quick sketch that captured something precise about the expression on her face. She was not weeping. She was not performing courage in any theatrical sense. She sat upright and looked forward and endured the journey with the same composure that people who observed her at the trial had noted and not known quite what to do with. At the scaffold, before she mounted the steps, she accidentally stepped on the foot of Henri Sanson, the executioner. She turned to him and said that she was sorry that she had not done it on purpose. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary moment of social reflex. The apology to the executioner has survived in the historical record partly because it was witnessed by multiple people and recorded, and partly because it is the kind of thing that is impossible to explain away or absorb into any pre-existing narrative about who she was. Whatever else she had been, whatever else had been written about her, the woman who stepped on someone's foot and apologized in that moment was simply a person. The guillotine at the Place de la Révolution, the same square that would eventually be renamed the Place de la Concorde, was efficient. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, was dead by approximately 12:15 on October 16, 1793. She was buried the same day in a common grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, without ceremony, without marker, alongside the hundreds of others the revolution had sent to the same ground. The fate of the people she had left behind played out across the following years. Madame Elisabeth, Louis's sister, who had stayed with the family through everything, was executed in May 1794 at the age of 30. Louis Charles, the child who had been taken from his mother and subjected to the attentions of Antoine Simon and later left increasingly alone in the Temple, died there in June 1795. He was 10 years old. The official cause was tuberculosis, accelerated by the conditions of his imprisonment and the collapse of anything resembling proper care, after Simon departed in January 1794. Exactly what happened to him in those months is a matter historians have examined with considerable care and considerable distress. Marie Thérèse, Charlotte Madame Royale, the eldest child, the one born in December 1778, survived. She was released from the Temple on December 18, 1795, exchanged for a group of French diplomatic prisoners held in Austria. She was 17 years old, had been imprisoned for over 3 years, and had lost her father, her mother, her brother, and her aunt in that time. She went to Vienna, eventually married her cousin, the Duc d'Angoulême, and lived until 1851, long enough to see France cycle through republic, empire, monarchy, empire again, and republic again, which is the kind of historical experience that tends to produce a very particular kind of personality. She was reportedly not easy company. The physical remains of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were exhumed in January 1815, after the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, and reburied with full ceremony at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of the kings of France. The state that had executed them was restoring them to their appropriate place in the national architecture, which says something precise about the relationship between France and its revolution that the French have been working out ever since. What remained after the burial was something harder to put to rest: the image. Marie Antoinette became, in the 2 centuries following her death, one of the most consistently reconsidered figures in European history, reconsidered not because the basic facts were unclear, but because what those facts meant kept changing, depending on who was doing the reading and when. For the 19th century, she was largely either a martyr or a symbol of aristocratic excess, depending on which side of the political divide the person writing about her occupied. For the early 20th century, Stefan Zweig's biography, published in 1932, humanized her in ways that had significant influence, presenting a real person who had been caught in circumstances she had not created and had not possessed the tools to navigate. For the late 20th century, feminist historians began examining more carefully what her experience revealed about the structural position of women in 18th century political life, about a queen who had no formal political role and was therefore held responsible for political outcomes she had no formal mechanism to influence. And then there is the cake. The phrase, "let them eat cake," or in the French original, "let them eat brioche," is the most famous thing Marie Antoinette supposedly said, repeated across 2 centuries as the definitive evidence of her indifference to the suffering of ordinary people. She did not say it. The line appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765, attributed simply to a great princess. In 1765, Marie Antoinette was 9 years old and had not yet set foot in France. The attribution to her appears to have developed gradually through the 19th century, attaching itself to her name because it fitted the story that had already been constructed around her, not because there was any evidence she had ever spoken those words. The most famous thing she said, she never said. This is, among the many ironies that accumulate around her story, perhaps the most efficient summary of how history had been treating her all along. The revolution that swept her away did not resolve the problems that had produced it. France went through the Terror, then the Directory, then Napoleon, then Bourbon Restoration, then another revolution in 1830, then another in 1848, then the Second Empire, then the Third Republic, each transition carrying some portion of the unresolved argument about what the revolution had actually meant. The execution of Marie Antoinette settled nothing. It was, at most, a moment when one version of France ended and another, much less certain version began. What she left behind was not a political legacy in the conventional sense. She never governed, never held formal power, never made the decisions that shaped the kingdom she nominally helped to rule. What she left was something more diffuse and in some ways more durable, an image, endlessly reproduced and reconsidered, of a woman placed at the centre of an enormous historical event she did not fully understand, carrying the weight of everything people needed her to represent, while the person underneath the representation remained genuinely, stubbornly present in the documents, in the letters, the sketches, the trial transcripts, the quick apology to the executioner if anyone took the time to look. And so the story of Marie Antoinette rests here not as a simple symbol, not as a villain or a saint, but as a person shaped by forces much larger than herself, living inside a world that was ending and a revolution she could not stop. The carriages have long since gone quiet. The palace at Versailles still stands. The Place de la Concorde is busy with traffic most mornings. And somewhere in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the woman who once crossed a river and left everything she knew behind is finally, permanently, still. If you are still awake at this point, there is another story waiting for you on the screen, another journey through history, whenever you are ready for it. And if this one stayed with you, feel free to like the video, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. It means more than you might think. For now, though, let your body settle, let your shoulders drop, close your eyes. The history will be here when you wake up. Good night.